to Skeptics in the Pub online. I'm here live. No, it's not a filter. I'm Kat from the Merseyside Skeptics Society, and I'll be your host for the evening. If you're joining us for the first time, Skeptics in the Pub online is a coalition of various Skeptics in the Pubs groups from the UK and Europe. We came together to form SITPO when the COVID pandemic meant that we couldn't have our monthly meetings in pubs. So now we host weekly meetings online on a variety of topics that promote science, reason, and critical thinking. For information about future events, please find us on Facebook or Twitter, or check out our website, sitp.online. The format for tonight is we will have a talk from our excellent guest speaker. Then we will take a short break, followed by a question and answer session. If you would like to join in the Q&A, please go to sitp.online/ask to submit your questions or upvote questions you would like to see asked. Our lovely moderators will be dropping that link in the chat, along with other useful links throughout the night. After the Q&A, we'll be opening our virtual pub, the Lock-In's Razor, where you're welcome to join us for a chat and a drink of your choice. Tonight, for our Darwin Day talk, we are joined by Dr. Jacques Launay, who will be talking to us about evolution and music. Jacques is an expert on the topic of music and social bonding and has worked on this from a range of perspectives, including investigating the origins of music making, the health benefits of singing in choirs, and the neuroscience of music to sound, of moving to sound. Please fill the chat with applause and welcome Dr. Jacques Launay.
Thank you, Kat. So I'm going to be talking to you about music and evolution, and I'm going to do this from a kind of range of different perspectives, as you'll see throughout the talk. So the title of the presentation is Music as an Adaptive Behaviour, a little bit less sexy than the Born to Dance, which I gave you as a kind of preview. So the first point here is that music is everywhere. So we experience music in really obvious places like music festivals, or when we choose to go to a gig, or when we choose to put the radio on. But we also hear music in the background quite a lot of the time. So it's also in a supermarket, it's in a lift, it's in a shopping centre. It's also on TV programmes in the background. And that kind of ubiquitous nature of music suggests that it's actually really very important to humans in a way that we don't always recognise. So the prevalence of music suggests that it does something more than we seem to acknowledge a lot of the time. And so the question is why? Why do we have a behaviour that we don't really recognise the purpose of, but it seems to be really important to us? As a kind of point here, sort of like gathering us together in our way of thinking, I'm going to explain what I think music is. And part of the purpose here is that often when we think about music, we think about it in a current day setting. And if I'm talking about the evolutionary origins and the adaptive purpose of music, we actually need to think about it in a completely different context, because we know that recording has only really existed in the last 100 years. So the way that we think about music is very different if we go back more than 100 years. We can't listen to it by a device. We have to listen to another person. So another person has to be making the music if we go back that far. So it has to be live. It also has to be accompanied by movement. So if we don't have recording equipment and we don't have electronic devices, we have to move in order to make music. And that means that music and dance are intrinsically connected with one another in a way that we don't often recognize now. The other thing is that if we go back even further in our evolutionary history, if we go back, say, more than 1,000 years, we get into situations where humans are actually mostly interacting with people they know. So it's quite unlikely. We have a less connected world, which means you're more likely to be creating music with someone that you know, someone from your kind of social group. And the other thing is you're less likely to be thinking about expertise. So everyone in many human societies considers themselves musical. If everyone is brought up making music with their neighbours and with their friends, then we're much less likely to get people thinking, I'm terrible at music, I'm not going to join in with this. So it's a relatively kind of recent phenomenon. It's a relatively kind of Western European type concept that, lots of us think we're not very good at music. So when I talk about music, what I'm really talking about is something which involves movement in order to produce that music. It involves interacting with people that we know. It's going to be something that happens in real life in the moment, and it probably involves everyone. And I guess the way that we can think about this in our current context is along the lines of, being in a nightclub or something. that's the kind of context that we're talking about. Everyone moving together. You don't have to worry. Well, maybe you have to worry a little bit about whether you're terrible at dancing, but you're basically just moving in time for the music and you're being involved in that in a way that's very different from the sort of sitting and watching a performance with no movements that we often experience music in our kind of current culture. So that's what I mean when I'm talking about music. And next, I'm just going to tell you what I'm going to tell you. So as a warning in advance of the presentation, so this is easier to understand what's going on. So first, I'm going to talk a bit about the relationship between language and music and the kind of intrinsic connections they have. Then I'm going to talk about some of the proposed adaptive purposes of music. So what have people said before, might be the purpose of music. And then I'm going to talk to you about music as an adaptive technology for social bonding. And that's the thing that I'm really interested in, and I think that will come across. That's the thing where I've done my studies on. And so that's the bit where I'll explain what I think the purpose of music is, and why I'm not so convinced by other versions of this. So the relationship between language and music is really, by the looks of it, language and music are really connected with one another, but they both are very ancient human behaviors. They're evolved behaviors that humans seem to have and have had for a very long time. And one of the really fundamental issues we have in the kind of getting apart to the kind of origins of music and language are that we don't have a very good archaeological record of either of them, and especially so for language we can use vocal tract, like bones from vocal tracts, so we can have some kind of indication of when our vocal tract changed to make it possible to speak, but actually our vocal tract isn't that different from other species who don't have language, so we have some kind of indicator on that front. We also have some indicators which relate to the way languages evolve, and we also have some information about genetics, and we can get some sort of idea that language might have evolved as a behavior kind of 150,000 to 350,000 years ago. When it comes to music, we have even less kind of information from the archaeological record. And what we do have are bone flutes. So we found bone flutes in various places in Europe and elsewhere. And the oldest of those is 40,000 years ago. So that's been dated 40,000 years ago. And so between those two, so this kind of 100,000 years ago, more than that, maybe 200,000 years ago for language, and music around 40,000 years ago. But there's a big disparity. But the point where we can imagine an early hominid creating a bone flute seems like it would probably be quite late into musical production, right? So if we're already at the point where we're creating a specific technology in order to make a piece of music which sounds like a human voice, which is what a flute sounds like, it's likely that we already had some kind of basic version of music. So it's probable that music is much older than that, that 40,000 value would suggest. And I'm going to come onto it, but I think they probably actually come from the same origins. I've given you some pictures of brains here. I don't know if the skeptics in the pub like that, but potentially. And this is just to make the point that music and language. So every species that has music, in the way that I would define it, so as a generative and flexible thing, so something that can be created and can be manipulated in a flexible way, so music in that context and language in that context, there is no species that doesn't have both, because we are the only species that has those two things. So if we look from a kind of comparative approach, we use a comparative approach where you look at different species and you try to work out what's going on there. what we find is that music and language basically always coexist because humans have them and no other species has them in the same way. And I will mention in a minute something about species that have some kind of similar behaviors, but not quite the same. And the point of the picture with the brains here is really just to show you. So the areas that are highlighted here are either red or blue, red or blue, or like light blue color, which shows that the areas of the brain are in common. And this is a study which just required people to come up with new sentences and come up with new melodies. And the areas of the brain that are involved in generating sentences and generating melodies are very similar. So from a neuroscientific perspective, we could say that music and language look like they're using similar areas of the brain. There are subtle differences, though, which you can ask about. And so we could, so one way actually that I used to look at this is that music felt like it was a kind of early communication tool that we had before we had language. The language over music is that it has referential meaning. So I can say lamp, I can see there, and you will understand what I mean. So we have direct referential meaning, and music could have been a preferential form of communication, but it's also possible that there's actually just a reciprocal relationship between language and music, and that they could have adapted, they could have developed from the same thing. And on this slide here, I have a picture of Snowball, the cockatoo. And I don't know if you have met Snowball before, but Snowball is a cockatoo who dances very much in time to the song Backstreet's Back by the Backstreet Boys. And this was identified by his owners and was put online and has since been studied by proper scientists. And they've also done subsequent studies, and in fact, he can dance to a few other songs. And the interesting thing here is that cockatoos have quite good abilities to mimic, so they can use language in using kind of fine temporal precision, which is required to produce language. So it's interesting that he can also then dance in time to music. That suggests that maybe just having that really fine rhythmic precision, which is required to produce language, gives you music for free. And the two are very intrinsically linked in the way that they develop. Conclusion from this, and one of the ways that it's been looked at, and particularly, a couple of people who've looked at this, but Stephen Mithen has suggested specifically that music and language could have originated from the same pre-linguistic communication method, which he called the which is like a hum, holistic, manipulative, multimodal, musical, and mimetic. So it's a form of communication that basically is holistic. It represents everything in the way that it's produced. It's manipulative, as in it's designed to encourage other people to do things. So it's like to make actions, to create actions in other people. It's multimodal in that it involves more than just auditory, just auditory stimulus. It also involves movement. It's musical in that it's got that kind of lyricism that we have around music, and it's mimetic, as in it's something that we learn through replication. So it could be through replicating the sounds of an animal or of other humans. So this is the kind of basis of the argument around music and language, that maybe they both came from this early pre-linguistic form of communication, and language then sort of differentiated itself to become really good at giving us referential meaning. So we have this kind of content which tells you exactly what someone else is saying, whereas music adapted to have its own purpose. And we still have music, so it hasn't disappeared as a kind of feature in our culture. We still have music which is separate from language, and that suggests that it was capable of performing some other function that language didn't perform better. So they start off as a communication method, and they differentiate at some stage, and we have language becoming totally referential and music doing something else. So the question is, what's that other thing? A kind of null hypothesis here. So that the theory that we have to disprove is was kind of suggested by Steven Pinker, who's a linguist, and he described music as being like auditory cheesecake. The idea being that it appeals to us like a cheesecake does. A cheesecake is sweet and fatty, and it's delicious. But we wouldn't claim that a cheesecake has any adaptive purpose. It just happens to appeal to us in a number of different ways. And his argument is that there's no real reason we should see music as being any different from auditory cheesecake. We could probably get into arguments about this later, but it feels like music is a behaviour that does exist in every human culture, as far as we know. It seems to perform some sort of purpose, like it seems to have some functional purpose. And cheesecake isn't a very good example because this is actually it's something that it only exists in one culture. So we have food everywhere, but we don't necessarily have cheesecake everywhere. So there's not a kind of easy comparison there, but it looks like music is serving something a bit more substantial than just giving us a small amount of pleasure. Some other suggestions about the adaptive purpose of music. So it could be the byproduct of other behaviours, and I've already discussed the relationship with language. It could be related to general auditory expertise, but some of the points I'm going to go through in a bit more detail are a bit more kind of selective, so a bit more talking about evolution and selection. And so one suggestion is that music could improve our ability to do other things, and I'll talk about the example of IQ. The second point here could be that it's involved directly in sexual selection, which would suggest that musical ability indicates our genetic fitness and makes people more likely to mate with someone who's good, good at music. And then I'm going to talk about, the thing that I'm interested in here, which is the idea that it serves some kind of purpose on social, group levels. So on to the IQ question, the Mozart Effect, and it was discovered in 1993, and it suggested that people had improved spatial reasoning after they'd been listening to Mozart. So they were given a spatial task; they had to rotate object in their mind and work out, what the object would look like after that rotation. And they seem to be better at this after listening to Mozart compared with another piece of classical music. Oh yeah, sorry. Been told to talk a little closer. There are a number of problems with this just immediately. So this doesn't seem to have any long-term effects. And if we're talking about music being beneficial for something like IQ, we would expect it to have a long-term effect. There have also been lots of attempts to replicate this study that haven't been very successful. And there's also just the study itself actually there's alternative explanations for what the effect might be caused by. And in particular, the types of music that were chosen in the study, actually, the Mozart was quite uplifting and quite fast, and the piece of music that it was compared with was actually quite slow. So it could have just been, a kind of speedy piece of music versus a slow one. There were other studies that have looked at music and IQ, and here's on your slides, there's one which looked at children between the age of 7 and 9 and studied them over a period of 2 years. And the comparison that was made was between children who were given music classes with children who were given no kind of extra classes. And in this study, there was an improvement found in IQ over that 2-year period for the students who were given the music classes versus no kind of extra activity. So there are studies that have found a relationship, but with this example, as with many others, there's a problem if you're giving one set of students an extra activity and you're giving the kind of control group no activity. So just being involved in some extra classes might help people feel more positive about things. And in fact, the self-reports, if you look at the self-reports in this study, it does suggest that students basically felt like greater levels of self-esteem through the musical activity that they're being engaged with. So it's quite likely, really, when it comes to these things, that's the way, the direction that relationship is moving in. Looking kind of more broadly at the relationship between music and IQ, it feels like it's actually more likely that people with higher IQ have the opportunity to take up musical activities. It's also likely that musical activities improve people's confidence and can lead to better tests, better performance on certain tests. I don't want to go into any kind of problems with using IQ as a measure, but it might not be a very good indicator of anything very meaningful anyway. And none of these studies have shown any kind of causal pathway from any particular type of music. So I'm just going to move on very briefly to a bit of information about sexual selection. So if music were a kind of an activity that we directly used to choose our mates, like if good musical ability, good dancing was something that was sexually selected for, we would expect it to be demonstrating something that isn't indicated more easily. And I'll give you the kind of example here, the kind of classic example in evolutionary psychology of why we're attracted to people is that facial symmetry is considered attractive. So we find facial symmetry more attractive. And it's been suggested that facial symmetry is attractive because it means you haven't been exposed to disease. So you're quite you have a strong, healthy immune system. And it also suggests a kind of genetic capacity of your body to produce a symmetric, facial pattern. And that means that when we're attracted to someone with facial symmetry, it's because that facial symmetry is indicating something about them. It's indicating their, good immune response and their good genetics. So if musical ability were to be a kind of sexually selected trait, we would expect it to indicate something about people's genetics that's in some way special and something that couldn't be indicated more easily through. So, for example, with IQ, something that we couldn't find out in another way. And most of these, I don't think, there's not a convincing argument that music is indicating something that we couldn't find out about someone more easily. And there aren't very many studies, or there aren't studies that really support the sexual selection argument. But I'm just going to give you a bit of evidence relating to this, which is from a twin study with 10,000 pairs of twins. And this looked at the relationship between musical aptitude and musical achievement, and actually looked at the number of children that men and women had based on their musical aptitude and their musical achievement. And it did find in men there is a relationship between musical achievement, where men with musical achievement are more likely to have more children. But that wasn't the case for musical aptitude. So, men who are seen to be musical, who are performing music, that seems to have some kind of relationship with how many children they have. So maybe people find that attractive, but it's not related to their actual kind of basic ability. So it's likely that whatever's attractive there, maybe it's the fact that they had spare time, they had spare money, and they were able to invest in musical ability. They were able to train themselves in order to do things. So it doesn't look like anything that's attractive about musicality is indicating something kind of meaningful about the person at a kind of genetic level. So I'm just going to move on now to the kind of, the core part of this. So the relationship between social bonding and music making. And the question is, does music play a role in making groups more socially connected? And this is, where I've kind of put my main area of interest. And I'm just going to have to take you back a step here onto how other primates build social relationships. So primate social bonds seem to come from two separate components. So one component is a kind of cognitive component, so it's a kind of brain-related memory kind of building of relationships. So if I am able to build a trusting relationship with another primate, I have some sort of memory of that. We have some kind of reciprocal relationship. We build up trust over time, and we have some sort of sense of obligation. And that's true of non-human primates too. So this is observed in chimpanzees and other primates. They're able to build up a sense of a relationship between different animals, and they remember what that relationship is. So that's a kind of cognitive component. But there's also something quite different, so a kind of emotionally intense component. And in other primates, this is triggered by grooming. So grooming is the process by which they pick nits from each other's fur. And what's been found is that this process of picking nits from each other's fur triggers an endorphin response in the brain. And endorphins are our natural painkiller. And they also, endorphins also have a sort of like they have a euphoric sort of reaction in us. So we feel euphoric after the release of endorphins, but it also looks like they have this relationship with social bonding. And so other non-human primates have been seen to groom one another for quite a large proportion of the day. And we know that that leads to the release of endorphins, and probably that's creating some sort of sense of social connection between the primate groups. Another thing that's been shown is that the amount of grooming that happens in a group is related to the size of that group. So with a larger group, they need to groom one another more in order to maintain that sense of social connection and that sense of kind of, positivity about other group members. In humans, so we are another primate, and it's possible that we would need to spend a large proportion of our time in maintaining our groups. So we live in much larger groups than other primates, and I won't go into too much detail on this, but we can ask questions about it. It's been suggested that humans kind of naturally would live in group sizes of around 150 people. And if we were living in these natural sizes of 150 people, we would need to spend quite a large proportion of our time grooming one another in order to maintain a sort of sense of social happiness amongst that group. We don't spend anything like that amount of time grooming one another. We actually don't touch each other very much. And so it's been suggested that maybe we need other ways of maintaining bonds within a social group which don't involve that direct individual contact. And probably worth saying now as well, we can maintain social bonds through conversations, but that's only ever going to be one-on-one. So we're not going to have that kind of capacity to bond a whole group at the same time in an efficient way through something like a conversation. So the kind of proposal that I'm going to explore through the rest of this presentation is that music is an adaptive technology which is developed for social bonding. So it's a behavior where we've brought together lots of different things that make us feel socially connected with one another in order to create those bonds amongst social groups. And part of the research that we've done to look into this is to break apart music making into its constituent components. So music making involves sharing intentions with another person. It involves sharing attention, so looking at the same or paying attention to the same thing at the same time. It involves predicting the movements of another person in order to move in time with that. It involves actually coordinating with that person, so making movements at the same time. And it also involves a shared experience of success when that is carried out. And all of those things, we picked these apart in a series of studies, and all of these things individually seem to lead to people being more socially bonded. So an example here was shared attention. We have looked at getting people to look at the same point on a computer screen as one another, and they report liking each other more at the end of the experiment if they looked at the same space than if they looked at different spaces on the screen. And I think Walter, who did that study, Walter Wolf, has now gone on to do that study with chimpanzees and has found there's a similar relationship there. So just sharing attention to a space can make you feel more socially bonded to one another. So the idea is that music brings together all these different socially bonding elements into one activity that we can then use to optimally connect our groups. And the set of studies I'm going to show you here are addressing three extra questions. So does exertion also contribute towards this relationship? So often when we're making music, we make big movements. And we know also that there's a relationship between endorphins and exercise. So it's possible that that exertion is a way of kind of causing a greater amount of social bonding. Second question is, does group size matter? because, as I said, we can already bond, one-on-one through direct communication through language. So the question is, does music provide something extra? Can it do something for big groups that we can't do with other activities? And then I might not get onto it, but I'm also going to maybe go through a study which is about whether coordination signals group bonding. So just to kind of start this, there are numerous studies now, since about 2009, which have shown that synchronization can make people feel socially closer to one another. So if we synchronize in time with one another, we'll feel more socially connected. And study that I put on the slides here is specifically looking at this where people were walking in time with an experimenter, or they were walking at a different time from the experimenter, and they were then asked to crush beetles in a beetle crushing machine, which didn't really crush the beetles, in case you're worried. And people who'd walked in time with the experimenter were more likely to crush the beetles. So they would crush more beetles, sorry, at the end of the experiment if they'd moved in time with the experimenter. So they were basically more obedient in that situation. But other studies have shown they also generally feel more socially connected with someone they've moved in time with. So a study that Bronwyn Tarr did with me a few years ago now was to explore this relationship with synchronization, but also to think about exertion. So does if we think a synchronized movement makes people more socially bonded, what does an exertive movement add to this? And so in her study, she had groups of 3 people either synchronizing with one another, so they were making dance movements at the same time as one another, or they were making dance movements at different times from one another, so they're synchronized or not synchronized. And she also developed a set of dance movements that were either really exertive, so making big movements with their arms, or they were making very small movements just with their hands. So we had this comparison between synchronized and not synchronized, and between exertive and non-exertive activities. And we looked at how socially connected they felt to one another before and after the activity. And we also looked at pain thresholds. So we used pain thresholds as a kind of proxy measure of endorphin release. So as I said before, endorphins are our body's natural painkiller. So we expect if there has been an endorphin release in a human, they would have a higher pain threshold after they've engaged in activity than beforehand. So we also looked at endorphin release in this study. And what we find is that there's a relationship with both with synchronization and with exertion. So people reported feeling closer to people if they'd synchronized with them compared with not synchronized, and also that there was an additive effect of the exertion. So if they were both synchronized and making exertive dance movements, they felt more socially connected to the people they've been around than if they were making smaller movements or if they were not synchronized. And we found the same relationship with the endorphin proxy measure. So this pain threshold, we found there was this similar change where synchronization and exertion were the kind of, they were the most socially bonding. So what I've told you so far on the music and social bonding side is that music can be a technology that brings together lots of different socially bonding elements. It also could lead to the release of endorphins, and that helps create social connections. Another important thing here is that it has to be effective in large groups, because I'm saying that music is some kind of activity that's really, special in that it can create these bonds with large groups of people. So we've also, tested that. And the study we did to look into this was with a group of choirs called Pop Choir, who exist throughout the UK and maybe in other countries actually. And they have a really interesting structure in that. So the Pop Choir generally they sing pop songs, and they have sort of 3-part harmonies. So it's a relatively kind of basic structure of music, and they're singing songs that everyone in the group knows, and they sing along to backing tracks. And the interesting element of this is that lots of different choirs, at least throughout London, learn exactly the same material. So they all singing along to exactly the same backing tracks. They learn the same songs. And once a year, pop choir also get together, and or the pop choirs in London all get together, and they all sing together as one mega choir. So we have these smaller groups that meet weekly, and they have their kind of normal interactions with one another. But once a year, they get together and they have a much bigger kind of yeah performance. So we were really interested in it. Basically meant that we could look at the same participants in small group conditions, but also in large group conditions. So we went along, or my student Dan went along to a number of sessions with different choirs around London and looked at how socially bonded they felt to one another before and after a rehearsal. And we also took pain thresholds again. So we looked at whether there was a change in endorphins um, between from before to after a rehearsal. And then we also did this when all the choirs in London met together for a rehearsal for their large group performance. So the smaller groups were around 20 to 60 people, and the large group performance was, I think it was about 230 people. So we wanted to know, is the kind of social bonding just as, is it as effective in that large group as it is in the smaller groups? And what we found, although I feel like this graph doesn't represent it very well, but what we found is they do report being more socially bonded with. So this is on the graph here. This is the change in how socially bonded they felt with one another, measured using two different measures. And we found that in both groups there was an increase in how socially bonded they felt to the group after the rehearsal, but actually that we found a bigger increase in the mega choir. So when the whole 230 people were together, they actually felt more socially bonded, that the activity was more socially bonding for them than in the smaller groups. And we do suspect that's actually just an artifact of the fact that they didn't know the big choir as well as they knew the smaller choir. So it's likely that they were meeting every week with the smaller choir. But we still take this as evidence that it's possible to get the same amount of social bonding through music making in a large group compared to a small group. And we also found increases in pain thresholds in both groups. So I've now told you, I think, music is a technology that brings together a bunch of different components which are socially bonding. I've shown you that it's effective in large groups. I'm just going to go through a study that this is whether it creates social bonds over time. So this study is now we think of as the icebreaker effect study, but that wasn't what it was called when we started, and this was done by Ellie Pierce. And what we did in this study, the idea was to look at whether music is different from other activities that we can do together in terms of creating social bonds. So is music better at creating social bonds than other activities that you might do with another person? And Ellie set up creative writing and music classes for adults. So she worked with an adult education centre and set up a series of different types of adult education class. And we followed those classes over 6 months. So from the second week, so the second time they met one another, to the 6 month mark, and we looked at how we got them to report how socially bonded they felt to one another before and after each of those meetings. And we took those, so we took them on the second session, then we took them after 3 months and after 6 months. And we just wanted to know if music was better at creating a socially bonded group than the other activities. And the results are here, and we did not find any difference at the end of 6 months. So by the third time point, and just to explain here, the white, the kind of non-filled in shapes here are before a session, and the coloured in ones are after a session. So what you can see is an increase at every time point from before to after. So they're feeling more socially bonded after the music session compared with before or after the creative writing class or craft class. But what we found, and I've labelled the graph wrong here, What we found is at the end point of the 6 months, they were just as socially bonded as one another. So there was no difference in the level of social bonding, and we didn't find any kind of greater effect in the singers compared with the other groups. But what we did find, and so this is on the right-hand side of the graph of the image here. This is B. That's the singing group. What we found is they were much more socially bonded after the first session than the other groups. So the singing group seemed to feel more socially bonded with one another after one session, whereas the other groups had this steady increase in how socially bonded they felt with one another. And so this is why we then started to think of this as the icebreaker effect, that music has this ability to very quickly bond groups of people, even if it doesn't have a kind of greater bonding effect over a period of 6 months. And I'll just show you so a bit more data from this study, hopefully correctly labeled. So this we also looked at how closely connected the social network was of the singing groups and the other classes. And so the closeness of the social network is basically how connected is every member of that group to every other member of that group. And so a higher network density basically means everyone is more connected to everyone else. And what you can see in this graph is the dark circles here are the singing groups, and the lighter ones are the other types of group. And overall, it looked like the singing groups had a denser network, so they were more connected overall as a group at the end of the 6 months compared with the other classes. So there might be some differences there in terms of the kind of level of social connectedness. So just to review again, so I've suggested music is an adaptive technology for social bonding, and it's effective in large group, and it also creates bonds really quickly. So that's another kind of way in which music is quite special. I'm just going to skip over this last study because I think it's too much to explain. But good performance basically also signals group membership. So there have been studies, and we've done some of these, which show that when people perform well together, we perceive that as a closely bonded social group. So I'm just coming on to the last few slides here. So just thinking about music across different cultures, in many different cultures, music performance is social and done by everyone. And so, whereas we might often think of music as being sort of one performer, it should be something that's enjoyed by everyone together, and it's often perceived to have some kind of healing potential. So if we're trying to think of some sort of positive value that music might have, there are these sort of musical rituals which bring people back into their culture. And so music is often seen as having some sort of healing potential, and that's probably because it helps people feel more socially connected with their group, and that has really good benefits for health and well-being. And just to kind of back that up with some evidence, this is an analysis which looked at lots of different studies into health and the effects of different different behaviors into health and longevity. And essentially it showed that having a strong social network, having lots of social relationships with people, is one of the kind of biggest protectors of lifespan. So it's has one of the most beneficial effects on our mortality rate. And I don't know if you can see in this graph here, but smoking, quitting smoking is one of the things that also has a lot of benefit on health, but that comes below having good social relationships. So even now in our kind of current world, we're more likely to live longer, and it's really beneficial to have close social relationships with people. So I'm just going to take you back, this is the final slide, to give the full evolutionary story, in case it hasn't quite kind of come across. So music and language come from the same pre-linguistic communication method. So this is this kind of form of communication that was non-referential and was quite holistic. Language has been specialized. So language is really specialized now to be direct and referential. It tells you exactly what I'm saying. We can directly communicate through it. But music has adapted to fill the communication niche that isn't filled by language. So while I can communicate directly with you with words, I could very easily be lying. There's a problem here in the way that language functions. So music can fulfill one purpose there, which is to convey emotional expression. So if you put some meaning into a piece of music and I perceive the same meaning, then it feels much more honest than if you just told me something through words. So music performs this kind of emotional role. It's also highly effective for infant mother bonding because infants don't have language. So when we don't have language, we use music as a communication tool instead. And the other, kind of key purpose that it has, the other key thing that language can't do is bond large groups of people at the same time. So language can't do that. If we don't have microphones and we don't have technology, there's no way we can even communicate with a group of 150 people. So music has this kind of core role in those three areas. But I've kind of gone through in detail the aspect of social bonding, so how music can make us feel more part of a social group. Thank you.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Thank you very much for that talk. I really enjoyed that. Before we go to the break, I just want to remind everyone that next week we're going to be joined by Dr. Dean Burnett, who will be talking to us about the science of mental health. Now, ahead of the talk, Dr. Dean would like you to send in your most hated mental health tropes and myths. So please send them in to us either via Facebook or email so that we can pass those on to him. During the break, don't forget to submit your questions for Jacques by going to sitp.online/ask or upvote any questions you can already see that you would like us to ask. We'll now take a 15-minute break and we will be back for the Q&A at 8 o'clock GMT. See you in a minute. I hope you're all feeling refreshed and ready for the Q&A. Before I start working my way through the list, I'm going to slightly abuse my position and ask sort of in a general way, why music and what made you think that it was worth looking at music from an evolutionary perspective?
So I guess like my interest in music is partly, especially from an evolutionary perspective, is partly that it doesn't have an obvious purpose. So, there are lots of kind of problems in science that we can easily solve, but I feel like, music is something most people engage in some way, and yet we don't have this clear kind of, rationale for why we do that. So it's basically just because I felt like there was a problem to be solved there, and it does feel like over recent history, it's gotten to a point where we have a bit more of an understanding. So we are getting towards having some understanding. And I guess another reason is I'm not a musician. I learnt piano for a long time as a child and was terrible at it. And so it's kind of interesting for me as a non-musician to look at what it actually does, because I really enjoy going to concerts and I like festivals and things. So it's one of those things where I want to know what is it doing for normal people like me, who are non-musicians, and how can we still feel like we're engaged and part of that?
Yeah. Okay, cool. So the first proper question is, if music and dancing is, as you said, done with others, is it music/dancing if you're doing it on your own? I.e., is it still music if I'm playing the ukulele on my own?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's something I've thought about a lot, because a lot of the time we engage with music kind of nowadays, it is on our own, and that includes listening to iPads and things. So almost most of the music actually that we engage with in nowadays is not actually with other people. So it feels like there's a kind of there's like a massive flaw in my argument there. But I think we do have to think about that fact that music would normally have been made with other people. So when we're if you're making music alone, that's something that you wouldn't have done if there wasn't a social context in kind of previous times. And I think one of the really interesting things is when you look at what people, so there are qualitative studies which have looked at what people report when they're listening to music on their iPads, and how they feel about that situation. And actually, the thing that people report sounds like they're getting a social experience from that engagement. So say people listen to iPads, on the tube, or iPods on the tube, because it makes them feel like they're slightly more than themselves. It makes them feel like they're like a kind of bigger person, like they're with a crew of other people, and it also protects them from the social world that they don't want to be part of. So interestingly, I think even when you're making music or you're listening to music alone, you still have some kind of experience of something social, like you're still getting a social experience from that. So yeah, even though it feels like it's alone, it's actually never really kind of totally alone, a musical experience.
Yeah, it sort of reminds me of research on laughter, because laughter seems to be like very much a social bonding thing, but we still laugh on our own, just not as much. So
Yeah.
like the behavior's still there, it's just not really fulfilling the function that we expect it to, I guess.
Yes,
If
exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
And there's no reason that can't be done. You can't, that you wouldn't want to practice something on your own that you might then do, with other people.
So Gray the Earthling asks, if music is social, how does bedroom dancing fit? So it's kind of a similar question.
Yeah, that's a similar question, I think. And yeah, I think it's basically, going to be a similar answer. That you are probably, well, also, I mean, I guess the dancing is interesting as well, because I think the dancing is probably more related to that endorphin release. And although we've tried to kind of, like, we have found with singing that it looks like there is an endorphin release, it definitely feels like it's more significant with moving. So if you're, if that act of dancing is probably releasing endorphins and is probably leading to some sort of that, euphoric positive experience. Yeah. And so that, the dancing thing probably is a bit different because it has even more of a, euphoria.
Yeah. Okay, and we have a question from Anonymous, who asks, so was Shakira being profound when she said that her hips don't lie?
um, that's a good question.
Well, is that about dancing or is that about the waist to hip ratio? It could be
Oh,
taken
good.
either
I mean,
way.
good question. I was just, yeah, I was going to say it feels very like it's going more down the sexual selection route, and I would say, like, from the evidence that we have about music as a sort of, an indicator of genetic fitness, there isn't very good evidence that it is an indicator of good genetic fitness, and there have been studies which have tried to investigate this. It's a really obvious thing, right? Does someone dancing well, is that like is that sexy? And that the answer is yes, it is sexy if someone dances well. But the second thing is, does it indicate something, that we couldn't get about them? So does it indicate something about genetic fitness? And there have been studies which have looked into this. So, like, can you tell strength, for example, from someone's dancing, or they're can you tell important things about their genetics? And actually those studies have never found that there is a relationship. So good dancing doesn't seem to relate to anything important about your genetics. So I think her hips were lying.
They're lying if we're talking about the way she moves them. They're
Yes.
probably not lying about her
Oh,
ability to deposit fat around her hip area.
yes, good point. Yeah. She was like, yeah, she was showing off the good hips she did have.
Yeah.
um yeah, do we need to explain about waist to hip ratios? Do you want to explain? I think you probably have a better
Um,
handle on it than me.
Possibly. So, for people who aren't familiar with it, a waist to hip ratio is the size of the waist compared to the size of a woman's hips. And it seems to be a sexually selected trait. Women with a waist to hip ratio of around 60% the size of their hips, so that's a waist to hip ratio of 0.6, are that they tend to be rated as more physically attractive than women with higher waist to hip ratios. Um, and that does seem to some extent to correlate with the amount of estrogen in that woman's body. When the waist to hip ratio shows up when you hit puberty, and your waist gets larger again when you hit menopause. Also, when you're pregnant, your waist to hip ratio changes because your hips stay a similar size, but your stomach gets bigger. So it seems to sort of signal that you are fertile but not fertilized. So yeah, that's the general idea around the waist to hip ratio.
Yeah, and in relation to dance, then, especially for women, it could be a way of accentuating your hips. Like, a certain form of dancing is a way of demonstrating what you have there.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that immediately, like, I mean, obviously we've already mentioned Shakira, but that immediately brings to mind belly dancing for me. Like it's that really skimpy outfit. It's like moving your waist in a way that I assume would be much more difficult if there was a small child in there. And like, yeah, really accentuating that body shape. That might be something worth looking into. Okay, so we have a question from Eagle. And he asks, using music as background while working, good or bad?
So basically, like, so there are two things here. So one of them is music that has sort of energy can make you more energized. So like, fast music, loud-ish music can sort of make you concentrate better on things. And so there is some relationship there. But it's very personal. So it's very much down to individual taste. And one of the really important things about background music is most people really don't like it if they don't get to choose background music. So in a sort of workplace, if you're with other people and you have to have, someone else has put the radio on in the background, that's very irritating. And most people find that very irritating to have someone else choose music for them as a background kind of thing. So it possibly can be good for concentration in some situations, but it actually, like, I think lots of studies have shown both directions. So it can help some people concentrate, but it can make some people way worse. So there's no kind of clear pattern. You probably need to test it yourself, Igor. Like, do it yourself, see if it works, carry on if it works.
I know it's not quite the same as background music, but I know that I can't remember whether it's studies that you've conducted yourself or whether it's things I've heard you speak about at other times. But listening to music while exercising can, like, people seem to exercise for longer. Do you have any idea what that's about, what that might be about?
Yeah, so definitely, I think there is this relationship with kind of motivation, basically. So music is motivational. There's also a really strong relationship between music and movement. So when we hear music, it activates parts of our brain which are involved in making movements ourselves. And so I have done some research which was looking at how you learn a relationship between movement and sound. And if we know that a sound is created by someone, and we know the movements that are involved in creating music, that makes bits of our brain kind of become active that would make those movements ourselves. So if I know that drumming is done like this, when I hear a drum, it makes my hand want to move too. So there's this quite direct relationship between music and movement. And definitely when it comes to the exercise thing, it's going to build up that relationship, and it's also going to kind of build in endorphins. And people don't actually, I just need to remember this, but people don't actually, they don't necessarily kind of move faster to faster music. So it's not that there's like a kind of direct relationship between those things, but it is, whatever they find motivating, they will kind of exercise more too.
Yeah. So is that music versus silence, or is that music versus, say, TV programs or podcasts? Like, is that something that's been looked into?
I don't know, is the honest answer. I'm trying to think of what comparisons have been done. I don't know actually. Well, I'll look it up for you.
So I've really put you on the spot there.
No, that's okay. I should know. It's an interesting question.
Cool. So our next question comes in from Andy Wilson. Hi, Andy. And he says, thank you. Why do I find certain musical phrases or styles or riffs or hooks and so on so pleasing?
So it's basically a combination of novelty and familiarity. And this is true of not just of music, but this is true of lots of things where we have a sort of, there's an immediate appeal to something creative. And basically what we like is something which is similar to things we've heard before, because that makes us feel good. It makes it feel easy to process that information. But we also like things that are slightly different so that it's not boring. So mostly our taste in a kind of with a kind of new piece of music that we might have heard that we haven't heard before, sorry, is we like it to be sufficiently close to things that we're familiar with, so we understand how to process it, but sufficiently different, so that it's interesting. And so it's probably, whatever the things are that you enjoy, that will be that combination, that perfect kind of balance between novelty and familiarity.
Okay, that immediately puts me in mind of the minimally counterintuitive theory of certain religious ideas. So again, for people not familiar with that, it's the idea that certain religious stories or miraculous stories stick in our head more because they're familiar enough that we can remember them, but just weird enough that we do remember them. So things like a talking tree. Everyone knows what a tree is and that it shouldn't talk. So a talking tree is just weird enough to remember, whereas like a interstellar motorcycle riding unicorn is just too weird. That's kind of the idea. And so the next question is again from Igor, and he asks, outside of the controversial Mozart effect, were there any attempts to determine objectively, scientifically, the best music?
I think I need to know what best music would mean in this situation. So I think again, it's very much driven by taste, which is very much driven by culture. So we have a different we have different associations with music as well. So it could be like if you're trying to look for music maybe that's going to make you do a task better, then having good experiences with that music helping you with that task before, that's likely to help. So it's likely to be quite a learned experience, and I don't think we wouldn't be likely to find a best music that will work, will do something beneficial for everyone. But there are so there are associations again with there are like kind of commercial applications of music. So say in supermarkets, they do find you're more likely to buy more stuff if they play faster music. So there are some relationships with particular properties of music and what people will do, but they're not there wouldn't be like one piece of music that would be the kind of perfect piece.
Yeah, I think it's not quite the same thing. It's not about what's the best music, but I was either reading or listening to something recently which was talking about so in linguistics research, people will often create almost phylogenetic trees of language, and like saying, oh, these languages definitely came from a Latin root, these came from there, this is where the similarity is. People trying to use that kind of method to analyze modern music. And the biggest leap or change in music styles, in popular music styles, is like rap, like that kind of music, because everything else kind of is like melodious and has a rhythm, and it's like even from rock and roll to country music, it still has a very similar structure. But anything that's like kind of 90s rap is like it's like a completely different world, and so that's where the biggest change is. So I don't know, it's not necessarily the best, but certainly the most revolutionary.
Yeah.
We have another anonymous question here. It's proposed the brain circuitry involved in language was duplicated during evolution, seen also in some vocalizing parrots who dance. Do they understand music?
So as well as that, the cockatoo that I mentioned in the talk, Snowball, who seems to be able to like dance in time to music, there's definitely another grey parrot called Alex who has been shown to dance to music. I think again, it's a hard question to think about whether they understand music. So it seems like they have been able to learn behaviors to move in time with music. So there are definitely the vocalizing bird species seem to have some capacity at least to learn to engage with music. And the other animals that have done this are seals. So I think there's a seal who can dance in time to a beat as well. So it feels like it is like you suggested, those animals who have some of this linguistic ability or have some sort of communication method that are more able to I guess, at least perceive what music might be about, and to maybe to extract a beat and move in time to that beat.
I think one thing that might be difficult with figuring that out is I assume that a lot of that research has involved kind of semi-domesticated animals.
Yeah.
So it's like, are they are they understanding it, or is this like operant conditioning basically? Like, do they know that the humans around them give them fish if they like nod in the right way? Like,
Exactly, yeah.
yeah.
And we just can't really then say it's music in the same way that we have it, because we choose to, it's spontaneous. Whereas exactly like you say, with those birds who've learned to dance, presumably that becomes associated with some kind of reward. At least, their owners look interested when they're doing that thing. So it's a very different thing from the way that we spontaneously want to move to music.
Yeah. Okay, I've got a question from Shuntz here, who asks, are songs written or are they discovered?
Oh, I'm not really sure. I mean, I think songs are written. Someone has to write them. Are they discovered? I guess. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure how to answer that. I don't think.
Okay. I've got an anonymous question here that says, lots of talk of evolutionary selection. Any evidence for the action of genes to support any of the conclusions, or are we talking about memes?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there are we do have, we've identified some associations between, particular like, genetic types and musicality. There aren't very many kind of really strong relationships. So there's an interesting syndrome called Prader-Willi syndrome, which is like it's a genetic syndrome, and it seems to be associated with people being highly musical as well as having quite a lot of learning difficulties. So people with this syndrome, it's very clearly, like, it has a very clear genetic basis, and it yeah. But and although it has this kind of association with poor learning abilities, it does seem to have a strong relationship with musicality as well. So there's, there are some instances of things like that where it looks like there could be some sort of genetic basis to musicality. There's also, I mean, there's a condition called amusia, which is basically when people can't perceive music at all. So they don't have any kind of pitch perception, and music is generally considered unpleasant. And I know there was an attempt to look into the genetics of amusia and to see whether there was any kind of clear, like, genetic basis for amusia. And I've never seen the end of those studies. So I can only assume that actually there wasn't a very clear genetic basis to amusia. So I think, there are some genetic associations, but I don't think there's no kind of clear identifiable genetic basis to, like, musicality.
Well, I suppose it's always going to be hard to properly pinpoint something like that, especially because both perceiving music and creating music is so complex. Because I think, so quite famously, there's that FOXP2 gene, which has a huge influence on a person's ability to produce language, but it doesn't seem to impact their ability to perceive it. And it doesn't leave them mute, it just reduces their ability to produce it. So something as complicated as language probably involves a whole suite of genes. It's not going to be like, oh, there's your talkie gene. It's
Yeah, definitely. And when it's come to so when people have looked at kind of neurological problems and how they relate to music, it's been separated out into like 8 different domains, I think. So, associations between particular kind of lesions that people have been kind of related to different aspects of pitch and rhythm. And it's proposed that there are 8 different domains. So, having split it down into that kind of that level of detail, you would think it could then be possible to say, oh, well, this, there's a certain kind of set of genetics which are associated with this particular problem, but that hasn't been found. So despite the fact that we have got some sense of what the domains of musicality are, we don't seem to have got to the stage where we can say, and, a kind of genetic problem here leads to this particular problem with processing.
Yeah. We have a question from Phil, who asks, does music deemed emotive, e.g. music in minor keys, create greater social bonds than generic music solely for the purpose of dancing or general social music?
That's a good question. I think like it's so when I'm thinking about the social bonding effect, I kind of think it's probably very related to the endorphin release stuff. It's related to the kind of physiological experience that you get when you're around other people during the music making. So if there's an emotional kind of reaction that you have, which is really salient, so it's really kind of like, it's something that you remember really clearly, then it could be more socially bonding. So the fact that you have an emotional reaction to that could mean it's a more socially bonding experience than a non-emotional kind of piece of music to you. The important thing to kind of caveat there is if you're socially dancing with other people, I think that's probably the more bonding thing, because that's leading to all of this endorphin release. So I would say it's really probably about the kind of neurochemical thing that's going on for you when you're engaged with that music. And it might be that a really, sound piece of music is leading to that greater emotional connection. And that could mean you feel more socially connected with someone, or it could mean you're just moving really hard and that is meaning you're kind of getting all of this endorphin release, and that makes you feel more socially connected with someone.
Okay. We have a question from Gray the Earthling, and they asks, cats are capable of a wide variety of interesting and irritating vocalizations. So why do they seem to have absolutely no understanding of musical rhythm? I wonder what experience Gray the Earthling has had that makes him sure that cats have absolutely no sense of rhythm. Like, how many cats have you tried to dance with?
Yeah, I mean they do. I have to say I've never seen a cat look like it has musical rhythm, so it's a fair point, right? Like I don't think cats seem to have that going on. Yeah, I don't know. I guess maybe they don't have. I mean, I don't know if I should answer it seriously, but I guess they don't have the fine rhythm perception that might be required. But I don't know. I mean, yeah, I think it's really interesting. They're like the comparison of different animals who do seem to have some sort of musical capacity compared with those who don't. And you would think that animals who've been around us for a long time, like cats and dogs, should be better, right? Like you think they're the ones who should have learned, if it were possible to learn, to engage with music, because they're the ones who get the reward. But it doesn't quite seem to be that way.
I suppose, I guess, given that humans have that musicality and presumably cats and dogs don't, but some birds do you think that's a case of musicality kind of evolving once and going extinct at various points, or do you think it's evolved more than once?
Yeah, I don't know. I still think it's related to this like really good rhythm perception ability, and like it's interesting that it seems to like some species seem to have the capacity for music without having any behaviors which would suggest that. So like the seal, who can like move in time to music, it feels like the capacity for kind of musical engagement is maybe not as hard as we would want it to be. And also that there's examples of fireflies can like synchronize with one another in order to flash, make a big flash so they can attract mates. So maybe the kind of that kind of basic capacity for music is relatively easy to achieve. But developing the kind of behaviors that we have that relate to music is, there's much more ritual involved. There's much more going on in a kind of larger context, and that thing hasn't evolved ever in any other situation.
I wonder if cats can dance, they just refuse to do it for us. That's very cat. So our next question is from Andrew from Peterborough. And he asks, do we know why music helps with social bonding? Is it just because it breaks language barriers and makes us feel good since we're creating something together?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. I think, I mean, like partly it is just that it makes us feel good while we're creating something together. And it's all those sort of different elements of music making that come together in one activity that seem to be socially bonding. And maybe it's also worth mentioning, like I think of music as being quite similar to sports, which I think is always controversial around music psychologists and sports psychologists, because they, we generally see those as quite different types of activity. But I would say all that kind of act of coordinating with another person and thinking about what they're doing in order to do a similar thing or a different, a related thing, and the physicality, and the sort of, the sensory overload that would go on when I assume would go on when you're involved in a sports activity. I don't actually know. I think all of those are really similar, and I think we probably just have to take the fact that maybe they have very similar effects, and maybe different people are often involved in musical activities compared with sporting activities, but probably just that those basic components which make up a kind of socially bonding music also make up a socially bonding sports activity.
Okay. Our next question is from Andrew H. And he asks, what's the deal with these puritanical religious types wanting to ban music as the work of the devil? Are they denying their humanity and human nature?
Yeah, I mean, maybe music's too good. Is that the like maybe music's too good, and that's the reason to get rid of it. It's also, I mean, it's interesting because like religion is another social bonding thing, and like religion is a much more, I guess, much more structural social bonding thing. So music is something we can do at a, with relatively little kind of organization around it, whereas the whole point of religion is it's this kind of organized concept, and you have a set of people with a set of instructions. So it's feasible that some part of religion doesn't really like music because it's like, well, you're doing the same thing as me, but I don't in a different way. And it's also interesting that many religions have music completely embedded in their practice. So most religions do in some way make use of the fact that music is socially bonding, but yeah, maybe some of them just don't like that.
Yeah, it is possibly just that puritanical thread of this biscuit is too nice, I must feel terrible kind of mentality.
Yeah.
Our next question is another anonymous one, and they ask, many highly intelligent neurotypical scientists can't tolerate the sound waves making up music. In your view, could humans be evolving away from the need of it?
I think there are lots of people actually who just don't like music at all, and yeah, that this condition that amusia has been identified as, like, people who just really can't process music, and it means they really don't enjoy music in any kind of way. So I think there probably always have been people who just don't really engage with music and don't enjoy it for whatever reason. I don't think that, yeah. I mean, it's not weird, really. I guess that there's always going to be a proportion of the population who just don't engage with anything. There's always going to be someone who, yeah, isn't sort of enjoying that thing.
The idea of evolving away from it sounds very strange. I don't know what the evolutionary pressure would be there to kind of force us away from enjoying music. That would be very strange.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure there could be like a pressure that could evolve us away from it. I don't know. Yeah, we'll see. Maybe when we're like all unlocked down, we'll all be like, oh, what was the point in going to festivals anyway? I did have that after the first lockdown. I was like, oh, what's the point in going to a pub? It's so expensive compared with drinking at home. But after a few weeks, I was back in the pub again, completely forgotten that resolution. So yeah.
Okay, our next question is another anonymous one. And they ask, has the role of music in social and sexual bonding changed over thousands of years versus just over generations or not? Social group versus social class versus emo, punk, pop, punk.
There's a really good thing in this that I can answer about. So I think there's something really interesting in like music taste. So basically, like the form that music takes is almost infinitely variable. So types of music kind of vary massively across the globe, but it could also take almost any form. And there's been part of the kind of 20th century where music has actually been silence, like music, was literally silence, and that was considered to be music. So I think we can imagine that music can take almost any form, and so there's this kind of infinite variability, and that means that any point in time, music could be representing something about who you are. And I think we take music taste as a really important signal of, what we think about other people. We've done some studies on this where we looked at similarities between different people, and we found that music taste was one of the biggest predictors of whether you thought you were going to like someone when you first met them. And that was bigger. Actually, religion was similar, but it was bigger than most other traits that we looked at as a kind of predictor. So so I think that is an important thing that say, like, what we associate with punk versus emo and what we associate with social class will be an indicator that we use when we know about someone's music taste. And that that will change over thousands of years. So the associations that we had between particular types of music 1,000 years ago will be completely different associations that we would have now, and we use all of those in building a picture of who someone is. And yeah, it kind of tells us so much information about where they come from and like who they are and what age they are. So there is a lot of information contained there in music taste.
Yeah, this is kind of anecdotal, but it does seem to be a very good way of creating in and out groups. Like, because especially with something like punk or metal, there's almost a uniform that goes with it. It's not just the music. But anecdotally, it reminds me of one summer I went to loads of different music festivals. And the one that I went to that was the best and had the nicest crowd and just the nicest atmosphere about it was Download, which is all metal. Everything else was kind of pop and indie and like much more easy to listen to. And I wondered whether there's almost like you can't go to like a metal gig if you don't like metal. It's not the sort of music you can just put up with. Whereas a lot of like pop, you can kind of put up with it. So I wondered whether, because that music festival was so niche, whether that's why everyone seemed a lot more socially bonded.
Yes, I think probably true. Yeah. I think if that style of music indicates a smaller group, then it probably means you feel like you're closer to the people who are in that situation. And we have also done studies looking at this. So with like music taste, as well as looking at whether you share music taste with someone when you first meet them, what that makes you think. We looked at more niche kind of versions of music taste. So we went into kind of, detailed different niches, and we found that the more the kind of smaller a group the style of music suggested were interested in it, the more you felt connected with the person when you first met them. So it's about indicating group membership, and it's about knowing that that group is a small group that you're, with someone you're more likely to be close to already.
Okay. Cool. Our next question is from Grimebeard. And they ask, it seems one of the things people from different cultures often do when they meet is share songs, as it can be done without shared language. Just what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So it's a really, so basically I think music is a very good communication tool whenever you don't have language. So in any situation where language is a problem for some reason, music is the tool that we use because it's got that non-referential character. I think it's interesting because music does also, it's like language in that we have a certain set of learned kind of conventions. So there is still a kind of a problem there. If you met someone and their music is so different from yours that you can't even really recognize it, you probably would still have problems communicating with them. So there has to be some sort of shared culture in order for it to be possible to exchange music. So so it's kind of like, it's easier than language to be able to share properly, but it's still not impenetrable. Like there is still some culture embedded in that, and it'd still be hard to kind of create music with someone if you had no previous shared culture and no kind of shared history.
I suppose that kind of reminds me of so when you look at how grown humans adults communicate with babies. Like they use motherese, which has much more tonality to it. Like you don't go, oh, who's a cute baby? Like I might, but you go, oh, who's a cute? But it's like you really exaggerate the emotion in it by using those tones, and presumably there's very little shared culture with a newborn baby.
Yes. Well, and there's definitely
So,
no language, and that's the main thing. And I think there's lots of situations where music is a better tool than language. And it's been, well, music therapy has been used for a long time with people who have you know kind of disabilities of any kind, and music therapy has been shown to it's been shown to help people who are in comas, and it's been shown to help people who are just like not very good at communicating through language. So autism, it's like music therapy is often kind of used to support people with autism, and the suggestion is that that's partly because language might be a difficulty, or for some people with autism at least, language is a problem. So music becomes a different kind of communication tool. So it's basically like a different version of communication.
yeah. Okay, brilliant. Our next question is from Gray the Earthling, and they ask, is there a connection between humans being good pattern recognizers and humans appreciating rhythm?
And yes is the answer. Quite simply, rhythm is all about repetition, and it's all about patterns. And it's absolutely like there's a book called Sweet Anticipation, which is by David Huron, who's a music psychologist, and he suggests that loads of what we love about music is the fact that we can make predictions about what's going to happen in a piece of music, and then those can be either kind of satisfied if we get it right, or they could be slightly thwarted when we get it wrong. But basically the whole idea of music is pattern recognition and then identifying and predicting what's going to happen next. So yeah, absolutely, it's a really key part of why we seem to enjoy music.
Yeah. There was once during my masters that the topic of like what could music be about came up, and this still fills me with embarrassment. I wanted to suggest that people who are good at music might have like a good sense of rhythm, and at that point everyone just started laughing at me because the assumption is like that I was going, oh, they'll be good in bed. But what I was actually
Okay.
thinking is, if you've got a really good sense of rhythm, like this is a not falsifiable hypothesis, so there's probably no point talking about it. Um, it probably helps with like hunting, and like if you're good at spotting rhythm, you can probably predict if something's going at that speed, this is where they're going to be in this amount of time. I don't know, maybe there's a way of doing an experiment around that, but
Yeah.
yeah.
It has been suggested. So like one of those theories about like what music might be about is something to do with how we deal with our evolutionary environment and how we hunt down things. But yeah, I've never been very convinced that like learning to dance would then make you better at spearing a lion, or whatever the connection would have to be. Like it would have to be that, like it feels to me like going and learning to spear a lion is probably better than dancing. Sitting at home dancing, I don't think it's going to give you the skills that will help you in the real world. So I've never been convinced that there's like a thing that you could learn in a kind of musical context that will then apply to a real context and actually help you.
Yeah. Well, that probably explains why learning to tango isn't standard part of military training.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So Richard asks, when you talk about children's development with music aged about 7 to 9, are we talking about exposure, play music, or educate them musically?
So in the study that I mentioned earlier, that was kind of music education. So it's children in a school being given extra kind of music classes, specific music classes, as a group. Yeah, so that was that example. But I just want to make the point again that doesn't really increase IQ. There's no kind of evidence that having that kind of extra musical engagement will kind of make you better at anything. So it's not a thing to worry about too much.
Yeah, and obviously, as you alluded to in the talk, there's like IQ is a really controversial way of trying to establish intelligence.
Yeah.
So our next question is another anonymous one, and they ask from a mammalian social biology perspective, is there any data on oxytocin release when listening to music?
It's a favorite topic of mine. This is what I intended to do my PhD on, sort of, I don't even know how long ago that was, 15 years ago. So there have been, so since about 2001, there have been suggestions that oxytocin could be the neurohormone, which is involved in the social bonding effects of music. There isn't very much evidence about it. And there've been a recent set of studies which were looking at people singing and looking at whether oxytocin was released during singing, but they used saliva samples, and oxytocin basically, like, it doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier. So if you take saliva, or even if you take blood, you're not going to get a very good indication of oxytocin released in the brain. And so although in non-human species we can look at oxytocin relatively easily, we can't really look at it. So in humans, you'd have to take a like a spinal tap in order to work out whether oxytocin has been released in the brain. And I've seen studies where there's a comparison between levels in the blood and levels in the cerebrospinal fluid, and there's no relationship between the two. So there's no point in us measuring it in the saliva or in blood. It's not going to give us any indication of what's going on in the brain in humans. And there's no way we're ever going to get ethics permission to take spinal taps to check whether music was socially bonding. So I don't think there's any evidence still about oxytocin, and I don't think there will be any kind of strong evidence about oxytocin. And, you know, for all the skeptics out there, if you see things about measuring oxytocin in humans, you should be very skeptical, because it's not necessarily representing something about the kind of the brain response, which is quite different from the bodily response.
Okay. So you said it's easier to check oxytocin levels in animals. Like, why is that? Like, to just chop their head off? Or...
Yes, you just chop their head off, yes.
Okay. So yeah, definitely won't really, get ethics permission for that. The next question is another anonymous one. And they ask, I suffer from ME, which implies loud sounds can make me really sick. Can music be a relearned? Can music be a relearned, e.g., motivation from music versus fear of avoidable surrounding noises?
I think I understand. So I guess one of the things here is that, yeah, if your association with music is negative, so if you have negative associations which you've relearned throughout your life, then yeah, it can be it can definitely be a negative thing. And again, those people with amusia, so this kind of inability to perceive music, they definitely have very negative associations with music, partly because the experience is often of other people enjoying themselves and feeling like they're left out of that experience. So I think if you're, there's no reason that you can't learn to have, relatively negative associations with music, which are based on your own experience. So yeah, I think that answers that question.
Okay. Our next question is from Noodlemaz. And they ask, have you heard of Armand Leroy's project, Darwin Tunes? I can't believe I forgot this. We propagated bits of music, assessing their fitness in that.
I haven't heard of it, sadly. I will look it up. And I'd quite like to understand what that meant. So but I don't, so I won't go on.
Okay. The other thing, Noodlemaz, I think we're moving on to the last question now. So this is from Paul, aka Particulate, and they ask, do hamsters dance?
I don't know. I think what we need to do is test that with the cats. Let's get the cats and the hamsters together and see if we can get them both to dance.
I would love to see an interspecies dance off.
Yeah.
I wonder if that's a really, really old reference to the early days of the internet and memes, like hamsterdance.com.
Oh yeah, that did exist. Yeah. So yeah. I guess they do on the internet, but I mean, everything happens on the internet. It's not it's not very good for real life.
Yeah, God, that's so old. I used to get through that via Ask Jeeves.
That is old.
Yeah. Okay, brilliant. Well, thank you once again for that fantastic talk, and thanks for the Q&A session as well. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you tonight. So don't forget, next week we do have Dr. Dean Burnett, and please do send in your most hated mental health tropes and myths, and come along for what I'm sure is going to be another excellent talk. And that is it for another week. Thank you all very much for joining us, and thank you to the behind the scenes team tonight. We had Malcolm and Laurie on tech, and we had Gerald as my backup MC, who helped me sort through the questions. In a few minutes, we'll be opening the doors to our virtual pub, the Lock-ins Razor, via Zoom. And there should be links to the call in the chat. But if you can't see the link there, it can also be found on our website, which is sitp.online. Thanks again, and see you soon.